Bonjour, this is 5 minutes of French. In this video, we will learn the 3 groups of verbs in French. This is a little tricky, but after a short explanation, we will do a little game, and by the end of this video, you should be able to recognize a group for most verbs. How do we actually separate the verbs? There are 2 conditions to look for. The first condition is the ending of the verb. Does the verb end with ER, IR, or something else, like OIR or RE? For instance, parler ends with ER, finir ends with IR, avoir ends with OIR, aller with ER, and être with RE. The second condition is to find out if the verb is regular or irregular. A regular verb means that when you use these kind of verbs, the beginning of the verb does not change. It stays the same. Only the ending changes. For instance, if we take the verb to dance, danser, you are dancing is tu danses in French, where the ending is not ER anymore, but ES. Or if you take the verb to finish or to end something, finir. She finishes is elle finit, where the ending of the verb is not IR anymore, but IT. For now, remember that all regular verbs in French are in group 1 and group 2. In a minute, we'll see how we decide that a verb belongs to group 1 or group 2. An irregular verb means that the whole verb may change when you use it. For instance, for the verb to have, avoir, I have is j'ai, the whole verb change. Same for the verb to be, être. I am is je suis. Or for the verb to go, aller. I go is je vais. Now remember that all irregular verbs are in group 3. Again, all regular verbs belong to group 1 and 2, and all irregular verbs belong to group 3. It is true that to find out if the verb is regular or irregular is a little challenging. But I will give you a few tricks that may help you. Hopefully, by the end of this video, you will have a better understanding and tools to separate these verbs. So how do we know a verb belongs to group 1, 2, or 3? Let's start with group 1. All the regular verbs ending with ER belong to group 1. For instance, parler, to talk, sauter, to jump, manger, to eat, marcher, to walk, or danser, to dance, belong to group 1. Actually, only one verb ending with ER doesn't belong to group 1. Aller, to go, ends with ER, but it is an irregular verb. Aller often changes completely when you conjugate it. For instance, you go is tu vas. So aller being an irregular verb, it belongs to the group with all the irregular verbs, group 3. Just remember that from all the verbs ending with ER, only aller doesn't belong to group 1, but it belongs to group 3. What about group 2? All regular verbs ending with IR belong to group 2. For instance, finir, to finish, choisir, to choose, rougir, to blush, grandir, to grow, or vieillir, to get old, belong to group 2. I have to be honest, it is hard to know which verbs ending with IR belong or not to group 2. Which verbs are regular and go to group 2, and which verbs are irregular and go to group 3. You mostly have to learn it with time by hearing and practicing. But there is a trick that helps even French people to find out the right group. When we use a verb ending with IR at present tense for we, nous in French, all regular verbs do ison at the end. Like for instance, nous finissons, we are finishing. Nous choisissons, we are choosing. Or, nous rougissons, we are blushing. The is sound is a characteristic for the group 2 verbs. For instance, if you take sortir, to go out or to exit, we go out is nous sortons and not nous sortissons. Since you don't have the sound is, sortir, although it is a verb ending with IR, it belongs to group 3. Again, all regular verbs belong to group 1 and 2. Finally, what verbs belong to group 3? As we saw, only one verb ending with ER belongs to group 3. It's aller, to go. All the irregular verbs that end with IR, the ones which don't do ison for nous, belong to group 3, like for instance sortir, partir. And finally, all verbs ending with something else than ER or IR belong to group 3. So for instance, avoir ends with OIR, être ends with RE, faire, to do, ends with RE, vouloir, to want, ends with OIR, and prendre, to take, ends with RE. All these verbs belong to group 3. And again, all the irregular verbs belong to group 3. So now let's see if I was clear enough, and let's do a little game together. We are going to try to find a group for 12 verbs. Let's start with couper, to cut. Couper ends with ER, so it belongs to group 1. What about aller, to go? Aller ends with ER, but as we saw, aller it's the only verb ending with ER that doesn't belong to group 1. It's an irregular verb. It changes a lot when you conjugate it. Like for instance, I go is je vais, so aller belongs to group 3. What about finir, to finish? Finir ends with IR, so it could belong to group 2. But does it have the is sound when you conjugate it for we? We finish is nous finissons. So yes, it does. The sound is. So finir does belong to group 2. Avoir, to have. Avoir ends with OIR. All verbs that do not end with ER or IR belong to group 3. Changer, to change. Changer ends with ER. All verbs ending with ER, except aller, belong to group 1. Sortir, to exit or to get out. Sortir ends with IR, so it could belong to group 2. But for we go out, we say nous sortons. You do not hear the is sound that all group 2 verbs have. So sortir belongs to group 3. Jouer, to play. You got this one. Yes, jouer ends with ER, and all verbs ending with ER, except aller, belong to group 1. Être, to be. Être ends with RE. All verbs that do not end with ER or IR belong to group 3. What about choisir, to choose? Choisir ends with IR, so it could belong to group 2. But does it have the is sound when you conjugate it for we? We choose is nous choisissons. You got it, yes. Choisir belongs to group 2. An easy one. Déjeuner, to have lunch. Déjeuner ends with ER. All verbs ending with ER except aller belong to group 1. What do you think about faire, to do? Yes, faire ends with RE. All verbs that do not end with ER or IR belong to group 3. What about obéir, to obey? Obéir ends with IR, so it could belong to group 2, but we obey is nous obéissons. You can hear the is sound, so yes, obéir belongs to group 2. To resume, there are three groups of verbs in French. Group 1 are all regular verbs ending with ER except aller. The great news is that if you know how to conjugate only one verb from Group 1, you can conjugate all verbs from Group 1. We will learn how to conjugate verbs from Group 1 in an upcoming video. Group 2 are regular verbs ending with IR, and they have the sound is when you conjugate them for nous. Also great news, if you know how to conjugate only one verb from Group 2, you can conjugate all verbs from Group 2. We will also learn how to conjugate verbs from Group 2 in an upcoming video. Group 3 are all irregular verbs, only one ending with ER, aller, some ending with IR, and all the verbs ending differently than with ER or IR. The not so good news is that for Group 3, you will need to learn how to conjugate a lot of different verbs. You can already check the videos for avoir, être, and aller. I hope this video helped you better understand the French group verbs. Please subscribe, like and share this video if this is useful to you. Don't forget to check the other videos. Thanks a lot and à bientôt. See you soon.